JavaScript events and callbacks. So the primary interface of JavaScript is what we think about as events that happen on a web page. So what types of events might affect our user interface? Users can interact with a page element by clicking on it, by scrolling it, by dragging it, depending on the interaction. You could have timers that expire, and you could have data that comes through a server that you ask to download to a server. And so one of the primary interfaces that JavaScript provides is interacting with the web page in what we call an event-driven manner. We typically associate these events with a DOM element, and you've actually seen a little bit of this in the demos of jQuery when we say some element.onClick. That is an event that represents the user clicking on an element. Nearly every HTML element can be associated with things like clicking, and the web page itself or the document itself has standard events that apply to the whole page, such as, is this thing ready to load? And our goal here is basically that we're going to bind a handler or a function to a particular type of event. So that's things like clicking, mouse up, mouse down, whatever it might be. And we can bind those functions to one or more elements as well. So we can leverage the fact that CSS selectors, return not just one element, but potentially many elements. And we can also leverage the fact that an HTML DOM is a hierarchy. So we can choose whether to bind things at the top of the hierarchy or just to one specific element. What's right depends on your use case. So how do we think about manipulating the DOM using events? The first thing that we want to do is identify which kind of elements we should be applying this event handler to. Typically, that's going to look like finding the right kind of CSS selector that identifies the subset of elements that we want. And while you can leverage things like the hierarchical nature of DOM elements, it's probably simplest to think about, how do I find all of the edit buttons on a page? Or how do I find all of the title links or show links or something for my particular action that I want to do? Once we identify the elements, we need to figure out what kind of triggers we want to happen. So is that a click? Is that a mouse up, a mouse down? More often than not, the types of things that we're thinking about probably are click events, but there's all sorts of other cases. And finally, we need to write the desired function. And I'll show examples actually of a framework like Bootstrap later that provides custom events and custom triggers that we might want to leverage. The final step is that typically we need a setup function on our web page that actually does this binding. Before, in a previous section, we talked about the fact that one of the ways to call jQuery is to provide a setup function because our whole web page might not be loaded when our JavaScript is executed. So typically, we write our code that does all of the binding, and then our final step is to write a function that, once the page is ready, actually sets up those bindings. And we'll see that in a moment. Mozilla has a good summary of all the recognized kinds of events. It really depends on what you're trying to do. But if you're asking the question, can I write some JavaScript that does this thing? The answer is probably yes. And what about things that the browser handles that you can interact without JavaScript, like buttons and links and form elements? Well, if you're customizing that behavior, the browser provides a standard mechanism for this. So it's going to run your registered handlers. If that handler returns false, then it doesn't take any other action. Otherwise, the default actions follow the handler that you registered. So in your client-side forms, you can do things like run additional validations or provide additional feedback and control whether or not that form actually posts to the server. And the nice thing here is we can think about is we get a lot of standard functionality for free, but again, we can progressively enhance the experience by registering our own handlers that augment functionality. So just as a reminder, we can use jQuery and its DOM elements to provide all this interaction. So what we're typically doing is selecting elements, binding them with a function like jQuery.on. Then when a user clicks, we call a standard function as a callback, which might do other DOM manipulation with jQuery. And in a further section, we'll go through and look through some examples. The final step, of course, is to make sure that we use the step of registering those callbacks, typically by just passing a function to the global jQuery function to register a setup handler. And we'll see that in a moment. It's a little abstract for now, but we'll see some demos in a couple minutes. One of the best reasons that you will find yourself using JavaScript is the term that you've probably heard of called AJAX, or asynchronous JavaScript and HTML. AJAX is a standard DOM API that implements XML HTTP request, or commonly known as XHRs, which allows JavaScript to contact a server in the background without needing to refresh the page. Typically, right, in a request reply HTTP protocol, we need to ask the server for some data and get a reply back. XHR doesn't change that, but allows us to do this in the background without the user needing to click on a particular link. It's called AJAX, and the term XML is used because it was built in the 90s by Internet Explorer. But today, it really has nothing specific to do with XML or necessarily even HTML. It is just a web request to a server that happens in the background. So when you make an AJAX request, you typically get some kind of HTTP header like X requested with, and this will allow the server to make decisions about how to inform the content. So our controller action might receive an XHR request via some route, and in our controller action, we get to decide what should we render in the response. So we can return nothing and just render an empty layout 200 OK. That's sometimes useful if we're just pinging a server to say that some action happened. We can render a partial, like just the form for a movie or just the information perhaps, or a row in a table. You might call or implicitly call movie.toJSON and render a JSON response if you're working with an API. This is pretty common. You might render an XML version depending on your website, or you could just render some text. But what should you render probably depends on the interaction that you're trying to work with. In modern SaaS applications, rendering JSON and rendering HTML partials are probably the most common kinds of interactions. When you use GitHub and you interact with things like selecting issues on a pull request or selecting reviewers or assigning labels in drop-down menus, a lot of GitHub's interactivity is built by using AJAX requests where the server renders back HTML and not just standard JSON. But plenty of times you'll see websites that render JSON as well. In JavaScript, what is the basic AJAX lifecycle? Again, don't necessarily memorize this, but we're going to set up the XHR. We call a method open, and open is what takes in the actual data that we need. So we pass it an URL, we pass it an HTTP method, so get, put, and so on. We tell the browser that this thing is asynchronous, which is what you want in 99.9% of the cases. We can send the XHR with some data. So if we're posting, we might include our post body data there. If we're just making a GET request, well, GET requests don't include any data. So we just call it with no arguments. And of course, we can abort a function that we might need to cancel. And what happens here is because this is asynchronous, one of those arguments will have a callback. And so this callback will come back with things like a status, the response text, information about what happened, if there's any error code, and our client-side application gets to determine how to deal with those errors. So there's a lot in the standard flow of an AJAX request in JavaScript. So why do we use jQuery? Well, it's because jQuery makes this really nice and easy. $.ajax gives an object with the parameters. We give it a type like a GET request or a POST request, URL. It can automatically handle timeouts for us. And jQuery, typically, we ask it for 2 callbacks, a success and a failure callback. And how does jQuery know what success and failure is? Well, it uses things like the server response code to determine which callback to actually call. So JavaScript did make fetch happen. And the fetch API is in modern browsers, and it's actually really nice. It's something that works with callbacks in a different way, but we pass it a URL and options. And then we use what JavaScript calls promises, or essentially chaining callback functions, such that we say, fetch this thing, then asynchronously call a function that checks if the response is okay. It can handle an error. And JavaScript's fetch API, there's a final function called catch, which works similarly, but not exactly the same as a try catch function that you're used to in certain languages, or begin and rescue in Ruby, that says if something goes wrong, here's the function to call. But the fetch API has a slightly different semantics, but it's something that can be really nice to use as well. It's built into all modern browsers, but it's not built into old browsers. So when you talk about backwards compatibility, you'll need some tools to work with it. So in Rails, what does this typically look like? Well, we're going to write some JavaScript. We typically put that in a folder like app assets JavaScript or app/JavaScript, depending on your Rails setup. There's a file like application.js. In there, we'll load our JavaScript. Rails, if we include on the page, that will execute. When we have a controller action, we'll include code that processes that. And in jQuery, we'll do all the same things that sets up the hooks that we've talked about. So if we're looking for an example, here's a start at one, which is inside some Rails controller. Rails gives us a method called request.xhr question mark, which is a really nice way of determining if a request is coming from an AJAX request. You just get to use it for free. And so if we have an AJAX request, we can do what we want. In this case, we'll look at rendering a partial from a particular controller. And there's a reference here to some code.